In the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, William Shakespeare became the greatest poet England has ever seen. He gave the English a new sense of identity and a new language.
Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene.
And he gave the world the characters they've loved ever since.
Banish plump Jack. Banish all the world.
Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet.
But how did a poor country boy from Warwickshire become such a celebrity so soon after he arrived in London? It's one of the great mysteries of Shakespeare's life.
You see, 10 years before, Shakespeare had been a teenage father here in Stratford with no job and few prospects. How did he do it? How did he make that leap? And what did he do in those 10 lost years? That's what we're going to try and find out in the next stage of our search for William Shakespeare.
Now, it might seem strange to begin the search for William's career not in Stratford or London, but 200 miles away in Lancashire. I first came up here 20 years ago, looking for William. And I've come back to meet the descendant of one of the oldest families in England, Sir Bernard de Haughton.
Sir Bernard, hello.
Hello.
20 years on.
Yeah, so welcome anyway. Well, Michael, we're going now up the King's Stairs. The tradition is that James, when he was staying here...
Sir Bernard and his family think they have the key to Shakespeare's lost years.
Anyway, this is the banqueting hall, which is the kind of premier room of the house. And we believe from a family tradition, at least over 4 generations, down to 1799, that William Shakespeare not only lived here, but worked here. And here is the will of Alexander de Haughton. And it reads along the lines of, "In the name of God, Amen, the 30th something of August, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lady Elizabeth, Queen of England, etc., etc." Yeah. And then we have to come down a bit further.
Yes, I've got it here.
We've got it there.
Item.
Yeah.
It is my mind and will.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, there's long lines on it. I'm not an expert in secretary hand,
no.
but Sir Thomas Haughton, my brother, shall have all my instruments
yes,
belonging to music.
That's it.
And here's the key bit.
Yes.
I most heartily require the said Sir Thomas to be friendly unto Fulk Gillam and William Shakeshaft.
So who's William Shakeshaft then?
Indeed. Well, I reckon he could be William Shakespeare. Under perhaps an alias. It was drawn up in August 1581.
But why would Will have needed an alias? And why in his late teens would he have got a job here in Lancashire? The answer lies in the politics of Elizabeth's reign. You see, William grew up in Warwickshire in a Catholic family, and Lancashire was the stronghold of the old religion. Over 20 years into Elizabeth's reign, the country was still bitterly divided between Protestant and Catholic, the new and the old. Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Lord Burleigh, drew up surveillance maps showing the leading families whose loyalty was suspected. the Stanleys at Latham, the Heskeths at Rufford, and Sir Bernard's family at Horton Tower. Up here, Elizabeth feared treason in word and deed, and even in thought, especially in the teaching of the young.
So these books are returning to the house here for the first time in possibly 400 years.
So this is the library that Elizabeth's privy councillors sent their agents up to find here at Horton, yeah?
Posses were sent by Burghley to find these books, partly because, as you can see, many of them are controversial books. This one in particular, for example, is an ecclesiastical history. Yeah. It's a work, as you can see, of Catholic propaganda.
And these are families whose children will not or cannot go to Protestant grammar schools, and therefore learning in the home is one of the most important issues they face. How do you bring up the children in...
Absolutely. We know that the Cottam family in particular were heavily involved in this lending library system.
This is John Cottam, who was Shakespeare's teacher in Stratford in 1579.
This is the Stratford grammar schoolmaster, the protégé of the Hortons, one of a number of the protégés of this family who taught at Stratford. And we know
so William's Stratford teacher was a Horton man.
Amazing.
Could that be what brought him here?
We've got a wonderful edition here of Plato. It's Ficino's translation of Plato, one of the most important books.
And there's more. Years later, one of Shakespeare's acting company, Kit Beeston, said that when William was young, he'd worked in the country as a teacher. Was it here at Horton?
If we think that Shakespeare came here, some of these books could have been in a library that he...
I think if Shakespeare was in this house, he would certainly have been aware of these books. These books were pretty certain at Horton Tower in 1580, when, if the theory is correct, Shakespeare was here too.
I've got to interrupt you. Just look at this. Shakespeare's favourite book.
This is Ovid. And you can see what is amazing about these books and what is fascinating to us is that not only are these the great classic texts which would have influenced Shakespeare, but they're covered in annotations in a Shakespearean hand.
The hand of Shakespeare? It's easy to get carried away, isn't it? Looking for William. But look further, and this part of Lancashire is thick with Shakespearean coincidences. Down the road towards Liverpool live the Stanleys of Knowsley. In Tudor times, the Stanleys were the royal family of the north, and they too were sympathisers with the old faith. And Shakespeare knew them. Some of his earliest plays were written for the charismatic Ferdinando. A patron of artists and poets, 10 years later in London, Ferdinando Stanley was the man who spotted William's talent. And there are more tantalising clues close by. Here in Rufford was another local family loyal to the old faith, the Heskeths. This is where the mysterious William Shakeshaft came to join the Hesketh's troupe of players in this hall. So was this where William first trod the boards as a jobbing actor? First swashed his buckle? Elizabethans loved a good stage fight. You had to be good with a sword.
I find here
Did he learn the ropes here from old pros who'd played the northern houses? Met his first Juliet? There's an old Rufford tradition that William Shakespeare himself, as a young man, spent some time here. You can take traditions like that with a pinch of salt, but there is direct evidence for Shakespeare's connection with Rufford, and it's this. In 1599, when Shakespeare and his colleagues were putting together the deal to build the Globe Theatre, their chief trustee and backer was a London goldsmith called Thomas Savage. And Savage came from Rufford. Before I left Lancashire, I retraced the route that Will would have taken from Horton to Rufford. he would have crossed the River Ribble at a ford used since Roman times.
We can just get there at right time, you know. They must have waited till the precise time, you know, about half an hour before the tide comes, because once it comes, it does come. Oh, it's unbelievable.
In one of his earliest plays, Henry VI, Part 3, William imagines a place just like this. A wide estuary where the tide recedes and a path suddenly appears through the water.
This doesn't look
now, you can see that sandbank appearing now over there where we're going to start. So like you've got to walk diagonally down upriver, upstream, and make that sandbank what's showing there now.
God, it doesn't look very fordable to me, Bill.
Well, it doesn't yet, no. Tide will come about 11:15.
Right.
But we want to be ready, you know, for coming out.
Yes, I don't really want to get hit by the tide at 11:15 if you don't mind.
No.
It's so hard for us now, isn't it, to imagine William's fractured world. How scary it must have been for a 19-year-old born on the wrong side of the religious divide to chart a path between the extremes. And out there on that estuary, William's world felt lonely, dark, and dangerous. What I discovered here in Lancashire was the mood of his times, the danger so many English people lived through. William knew these families. Their struggle of power and conscience was his world, and it surely shaped him.
Clearly this is a moment where every individual, whether it's a great aristocrat in the north of England or a burgher down in a southern town, is under pressure from the government to declare their true allegiance. It's at a moment where the government is forcing people in the bond of association to sign up in church and declare their declaration, but at the same time, so is, of course, the Catholic missionary movement, forcing in the confession box every individual to divulge their secret soul. Here is an entire culture with two masters, both demanding a completely incompatible loyalty. That's an extraordinarily dramatic situation to be born into.
So whether William was shakeshaft or not, Lancashire is an important part of the story. But it can't be the whole story. Like any young man today, I'd guess he did several jobs to earn money. But remember, the trail always leads back to Warwickshire. Back in Stratford-upon-Avon, William had a family to support, and he's always loyal to the family. So the next hard evidence in the documents comes on the 2nd of February 1585. That day, William was back in Stratford for the baptism of his twins, Hamnet and Judith, named after their godparents, old friends and devout followers of the old faith. So he's still loyal to his roots. When he was at home, he lived with his wife Anne and their 3 children here in Henley Street, squashed in with his parents and his younger brothers and sister. He was now the main breadwinner, balancing those old loyalties with the need to feed his family. And these were hard times for the Shakespeares. William had seen the price of conscience, the cost of loyalty to the old faith. His father John had once been mayor of the town, a successful businessman. Now he was bankrupt. And when William was 22, he saw his father's final humiliation.
September the 6th, 1586. At this hall, William Smith and Richard Court are chosen to be aldermen in the place of John Wheeler and John Shakespeare, for that Mr. Wheeler doth desire to be put out of the company, and Mr. Shakespeare doth not come to the halls when they be warned nor hath done of long time.
Does that still happen?
It does. There's a direct parallel with present times because it's a disqualification situation if a councillor persistently fails to attend. And the penalty that John Shakespeare faced on that occasion is the same penalty that applies today. You are booted off.
There's been at least 2 councillors removed from office in my experience here
really?
Through non-attendance. Yes.
Through non-attendance?
Yes.
For the boy to see the father's career collapse like that, I wonder what effect did it have on him?
I'm sure he must have been a huge disappointment to his father. I'm sure his father used to say, "Can't you get a proper job?"
But now, as it often does in life, fate intervened. In the summer of 1587, who should come to town but the best actors in the country? The Queen's own company, the Queensmen.
Not much room, is there?
The way that seats are pointing. Greg?
It seems odd not to have King John sat on his throne, doesn't it?
Julian?
Their plays are long forgotten, but to help us bring them back to life, we asked the Royal Shakespeare Company to come over to the Guildhall where the Queensmen played that day and to give their scripts a go. Unperformed for 400 years, what were their shows like?
You, that with friendly grace of smoothed brow have entertained the Scythian Tamburlaine, vouchsafe to welcome with like courtesy a warlike Christian.
Rabble-rousing, anti-foreigner, and above all, anti-Catholic, this was the mass entertainment of Shakespeare's youth.
All right, here we go. This is the King John scene. Then kings and princes, let these broils end. Let's take the crown and set it on his head, that by succession is our lawful king. If England's peers and people join in one, no Pope, nor France, nor Spain can do them wrong. Yes!
Is it 1 bow?
2, 3, I think. As many bows as you think you deserve.
They're not caviar for the general. They are very much for the groundlings. And I'm sure, I think they were mostly touring plays, is my impression of them, that they were there for a political purpose. You know, they were there to give England a sense of its own identity and its history, and to be proud of that history and proud enough to go and fight for that country. It's England telling the foreigners to bugger off.
So that's the Queensmen. But what have they got to do with the search for Shakespeare? Well, just look at this. It's an Elizabethan murder case. It involves 2 members of the Queensmen, William Knell and John Town. It takes place in Thame, in Oxfordshire.
William Knell was one of the leading actors of the age, young and fiery, and he was certainly fiery that night. Maybe he'd been drinking in the White Hart, but he came out of the inn and pursued one of his fellow actors, John Town, into the close behind the inn, furiously and maliciously with his sword, with intent to kill him. And he cornered Town, and in fear of his life and of mutilation of his limbs, says the coroner's report, Town drew his own iron sword, price 5 shillings, and stabbed Knell in the neck, a wound 3 inches deep and 1 inch wide, says the coroner. William Knell, the bright hope of his generation of actors, bled to death.
So, when the Queensmen arrived at the Stratford Guildhall, they were a man short and looking for a good boy actor. The place was packed to see the great comic Tarleton. Elizabethan audiences adored Tarleton. He only had to stick his head through the curtain to bring the house down. The Queen once laughed so much she had to ask him to leave the stage. And after the comedy came the politics.
You, that with friendly grace of smoothed brow have entertained the Scythian Tamburlaine, vouchsafe to welcome with like courtesy a warlike Christian and your countrymen.
Now, Will had acted in plays. He'd even written poems.
Endured he many a storm and set himself against the man of Rome.
And I think this was the moment. He joined the Queensmen and left the family behind.
And think it was prepared for your disport.
Now you may think it's strange that a boy from a Catholic family should join a Protestant company. But he was young. He didn't have to live in his dad's world. And the proof is in his plays. He knows their scripts inside out. Stole all their best plots.
It was the Queensmen who first did the cartoon villainy of Richard III.
The planets change their courses for revenge. The birds sing not, but sorrow for revenge. The silly lambs sit bleating for revenge.
It was the Queensmen who did the old play of King Lear.
I am resolved, and even now my mind doth meditate a sudden stratagem. To try which of my daughters loves me best, which, till I know, I cannot be in rest.
And one or two of the Queensmen had played in Denmark at Elsinore, the palace of Prince Hamlet.
Kings and castles, all stored for the future in Shakespeare's magpie mind.
The Queensmen were a touring company. They toured relentlessly, all the way across from East Anglia down to Plymouth in Devon, up to Newcastle and Carlisle. They even played Edinburgh and Dublin.
If England's peers and people live as one, no Pope, no France, no Spain can do her wrong.
Just imagine what a change it was for William, the excitement and glamour of being a travelling player. And the Queensmen were no ordinary actors. They'd been set up by the government as a propaganda tool, and their job was to prepare the nation for war.
It's now 30 years into Elizabeth's reign, in 1588. What a time to be alive in England, and what a time to be young. William Shakespeare's 24, and he now finds himself literally in the middle of the making of history, because the Spanish Armada is on the way.
Around the nation, the watchers were on the coast.
Lo, here the end of lawless treachery, of usurpation and ambitious pride. And they that for their private amours dare turmoil our land and set their broils abroad.
And in every town, the Queensmen hammered home their patriotic message.
And every wight that seeks her grace's smart would that this sword were pierced in his heart.
The country was mobilised for action. The beacons were made ready, and the old swords and muskets were dusted off, even in Stratford.
Summer 1588, the constables account for soldiers. Paid for the soldiers' coats.
That was £8, Steve.
Paid for their conduct money.
£6.
Paid for flask leathers.
4 shillings. Those were leathers that held the flasks together for the powder for the muskets.
Paid for dagger girdles.
4 shillings and 4p.
Gunpowder.
9 shillings.
Paid to Mr. Alderman for a jack, a bill and a skull to go with the cart.
10 shillings.
And that all comes together as the constable's bill for charges upon our soldiers and was endorsed at the sum of £23, 18 shillings.
That was Stratford's contribution.
We were a long way from the coast, but we did our bit.
So the good yeomen of England assembled on the Thames, here at Tilbury. And at the same time, the Queensmen were working the towns along the south coast, boosting morale for the coming conflict. They reached Plymouth on June the 15th, just before Francis Drake's game of bowls was interrupted by the arrival of the Spanish fleet. For Shakespeare's generation, this was to be their finest hour, when the tiny island nation stood firm against the might of imperial Spain. And like later finest hours, it was soon turned into a national myth. And another myth was born with it, of good Queen Bess. The text of her famous speech to the troops we now know was composed after her death. But she spoke for all loyal English people.
I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and valor of a king, and of a king of England, too. Not Spain, nor any prince of Europe shall dare to invade the borders of my realm.
The English fleet was outnumbered and outgunned, but they won a tremendous victory, helped by the wind and by the fire ships. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was to be a defining moment in English history, confirming the manifest destiny of Elizabeth's Protestant state. After 50 years of religious turmoil, England's path had at last become clear. God blew, as it said on the Victory Medal, and they were scattered. On the 17th of November, church bells rang out across the land to celebrate victory and to usher in a new age of optimism. At the end of 1588, the Queensmen arrived in London. And if William was with them, as I think he was, what a moment for a young man to find himself in the greatest city in Europe. London was on the rise, a city of 250,000 people. It was the place of opportunity. And for William, for the next 25 years, it would be, as he put it, the very forge and working house of thought. Now, I'd guess this is when William made his next move. He left the Queensmen and struck out on his own. Not as an actor, but to fulfill his real ambition, to be a writer. But what was William like when he first came here?
Well, the first thing is you have to think away that image of Shakespeare as the balding middle-aged man in a ruff, the gentle bard, the icon of English heritage. This is a young blade. He's in his mid-20s when he starts writing for the stage here. He's still only in his late 20s when he's written the greatest cycle of history plays anybody has ever written since the ancient Greeks, or at least the medieval mystery plays. This is a young man, bold, ambitious in his art. He's funny, streetwise, sexy, and by all accounts, extremely good company.
And this painting may just be him. It came from close to his granddaughter's village, a diffident 24-year-old in Armada year. A face glimpsed in the crowds of Tudor London. But where in London?
This is Bishopsgate. No other street in Elizabethan London had so many inns and restaurants and hostelries. All the great coaching inns for East Anglia ran along the side here. The Black Bull, the Green Dragon, the Four Swans, the Vine, all gone.
Shakespeare's first known London address is here in Bishopsgate. Old London's gone now, of course, and you might think there's no hope of us being able to even glimpse his world. But by an amazing chance, this tiny quarter of the city was spared by the Great Fire of 1666. And in Queen Victoria's day, before they were swept away by the new age of the railways, the places Shakespeare knew were photographed. And in the National Monuments record in London, as if by magic, the warren of streets where William walked comes back to life. Here are the old London inn yards, with their wooden galleries, where Shakespeare rented a room for a penny a night. Here's the Four Swans in Bishopsgate, where they served weird and wonderful beers, angel's milk, dragon's brew, mad dog, and most potent of all, left leg. And here's the Green Dragon. Shakespeare would have drunk here. The Queensmen played next door in the Black Bull. And here's the narrow winding lane leading to the local church, so near to us, but now gone.
But there's one part of the old city of London that escaped the Great Fire, the developers and the bombers. Just come and look at this. This is the Church of St. Helen's, Bishopsgate. And we know from Shakespeare's tax records that this was his first neighbourhood in London. Tiny little parish of about 70 houses, so he lived close by here. Everybody knew each other, and if you come inside, you can meet the neighbours.
Bishopsgate was a nice, safe, middle-class part of town. Shakespeare's neighbours were pillars of the community, haberdashers, woolmen and their wives, merchant adventurers.
But it wasn't only the great and the good who were Shakespeare's neighbours here in Bishopsgate. There were artists and musicians. The poet, Tom Watson. Shakespeare was a big fan of Watson. And the spy, Robert Poley. He'll play an important part in this story. So interesting neighbours. And where did Shakespeare work? Come on, I'll show you.
Shakespeare's workplace lay a mile to the north, beyond the city limits, in the wild and lawless suburb of Shoreditch.
In Elizabethan London, vice, crime and the theatre went together. And out here there were skittle alleys, gambling dens, and even topless hostess clubs.
It was here in 1576 that a man called James Burbage built the first custom-built professional theatre in the world. And the site was behind Crispin's veneer shop.
Oh, Mr. Crispin. Hello. I was told that the original stage of Shakespeare's theatre must have been actually in the area behind your shop.
Now, Burbage was a Warwickshire man. Maybe that's what brought Shakespeare here.
So how long have you been here in these premises?
101 years.
Burbage's son, Richard, would be one of Shakespeare's closest friends and played all his great roles.
Such a Victorian London here. Look at this. You don't think these kind of things survive?
On this spot, Burbage built a wooden amphitheatre 3 stories high and 100 feet across. And he called it the theatre.
Wow. People talk about Stratford and the Globe on Bankside, but in a sense, this is the place where it really started.
Yeah, that's right.
Was this part of Shoreditch traditionally worked in those areas right back in time?
Well, this used to be the cabinet-making area of London. Oh, really? There were makers, suppliers, etc. They're all being forced out now, but except for us.
Gosh, interesting, isn't it? James Burbage himself was a carpenter by trade, I think. I rather like the idea that Shakespeare's company began here in this working quarter of the city. because they weren't just a bunch of thespians, they had other crafts and talents at their fingertips. They were carpenters, goldsmiths, leather workers, grocers. You could almost imagine yourself under the stage here, couldn't you?
Just imagine what it felt like for William the first time he was in the audience here. The size of it, the noise, the colour, the sheer buzz. There was no going back to the Queensmen after this. The big stars of Will's youth had been the comics, improvisers like Tarleton, with the same surreal English humour that runs through Monty Python to the Comedy Store players.
I don't know if it's him or the goat now, I don't know. You bring the goat up on this line. Oh, God, I can't tell you what you're doing now. You waved up, you think, did I, didn't I, did I, didn't I? Let's get about. I did.
But when Shakespeare first arrived, a theatrical revolution was underway. And leading it was Christopher Marlowe. 24 years old, same age as Shakespeare, the same class, but he went to university. Gay, hip, iconoclastic, when Shakespeare came to town, Marlowe was the best. And didn't he know it?
Now, clear the triple regions of the air, and let the majesty of...
In his first play out of Cambridge, Marlowe thrilled London audiences with the tale of the Scythian shepherd who conquered half the world, Tamburlaine.
Smile, stars that reigned at my nativity, and dim...
And this is how his star, Edward Allen, acted it.
Disdain to borrow light from Cynthia.
It's over the top to us, but to Elizabethans this was the new wave and the new sound.
Will send a fire to your turning spheres and cause the sun to borrow light from you.
Marlowe's plays made Allen so rich, as well as famous, that he built a school, Dulwich College. And he bequeathed it a unique set of theatrical papers which show us just how popular he and Marlowe were.
This famous document is the main source, really, for theatrical history from 1590 to 1604. You get here the receipts for the first nights of Christopher Marlowe's plays, the parts which were written for Edward Allen himself. For example, received The Jew of Malta, 33 shillings. At Dr. Faustus, 38 shillings.
Popular show.
Yes, a popular show.
But also in Allen's papers is a crucial clue to Shakespeare's career. It's a plot summary from around 1590 with a list of the actors' names. Here are most of the young actors who become Shakespeare's company. Augustine Phillips, Pope, Will Sly, Sinclair, Cowley, Richard Burbage, who plays all Shakespeare's great leads, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear. Some of them perhaps disguised by their first names here. Kit must be Kit Beeston, Harry, Henry Condell. There's even a Will here, although whether it's Will Kemp or Will Shakespeare, you can't tell. But here, more than 30 years before they're listed in the first folio, is the core of the greatest acting company that ever existed in the history of the theatre. And that company belonged to none other than the Lancashire lord Ferdinando Stanley. So did he bring William and the team together? Well, William's earliest published tragedy, Titus Andronicus, was first acted for Ferdinando. The Lancashire connection had come up trumps. The stage was set. To me, this is one of those great moments in history, no less momentous than a battle or a revolution. because this is the moment Shakespeare begins to write his own plays.
Is that yours?
And to help us imagine Will's early days, we went on the road with the Royal Shakespeare Company to do his first shows in the places he played them.
Wow.
Like the New Inn in Gloucester, the last surviving galleried inn.
There's no other inn yard that has the gallery still running all the way around.
And remember, they were youngsters then. Shakespeare and Burbage, Hemmings and Condell, setting out on an exciting road. And could they ever have guessed where it would lead?
We're very familiar with TV, but we've had less than 50 years of TV, really. They had less than 50 years of theatre. And that's extraordinary to think that theatre was a new form. It was a new experience for people. And it's kind of no wonder that they crowded into those spaces to have that charge, that electric charge of a live performance. They were being shown every kind of human experience, every kind of human emotion. And that must have been extraordinary.
With all the confidence of youth, Shakespeare felt he could do anything. He gave them the comedy of romantic love.
And why not death rather than living torment? To die is to be banished from myself. Sylvia is myself. Banished from her is self from self. Living banishment.
And the women in the audience loved this.
What light is light if Sylvia be not seen? What joy is joy if Sylvia be not by?
But in an age when plays had to compete with public executions, he gave them the theatre of cruelty.
Who is here? My niece that flies away so fast. Cousin, a word. Where is your husband?
My mother weeping, my father wailing, my sister crying, our maid howling, our cat wringing his hands, and all our house in a great perplexity.
He even had the cheek to pinch the great comic Tarleton's famous gag with the dog.
Yet did not this cruel-hearted cur shed one tear.
Oh, my dear Lord, lo, where your son is born.
But Shakespeare's passion was English history.
Antic death, which laughs us here to scorn.
Not the black and white jingoism of the Queensmen, but a world where right was on both sides.
Two Talbots, winged through the lither sky.
Where conscience battled with power. Where ordinary people are crushed by events.
O thou, whose wounds become hard-favoured death, speak to thy father ere thou yield thy breath.
Where the national narrative, good and bad, came alive before your eyes.
Poor boy, he smiles, methinks, as who should say, had death been French then, death had died today.
How it would have joyed brave Talbot, wrote one fan, to think that after 200 years in his tomb he should triumph again on stage to the tears of 10,000 spectators. War was the subject of Will's early history plays. Civil war, foreign war, just and unjust war. And the poets and the artists were the observers. When Shakespeare's Henry VI was playing to full houses, English armies were fighting overseas in Ireland, in France, and against the Spanish in Holland.
The English entry point for their war in the Netherlands, for soldiers, munitions profiteers and spies was the fortified town of Vlissingen, which the English called Flushing.
Just as in the Cold War, spying was the secret theatre of the Elizabethan world. And here in Flushing, a chain of events began which would have a dramatic impact on Shakespeare's career. Among Elizabeth's spies here that winter were two men known to Shakespeare. The first was his neighbour in Bishopsgate, Robert Pooley.
Among Elizabeth's state papers are the payments to Pooley for his trips here to Flushing and on to Antwerp and The Hague and Brussels on Her Majesty's secret matters of great importance. We'll hear more about Robert Pooley in this story. But who else turns up among these papers here in Flushing? But the man whose plays were wowing the London crowds at the Rose Theatre, Christopher Marlowe.
Marlowe had been recruited as a spy at Cambridge.
Now, as any spy master will tell you, spies are supposed to be unobtrusive and discreet. But Christopher Marlowe wasn't that sort of guy. He loved to tread on people's toes, and the more offence, the better. Try this. Those who love not tobacco and boys are fools. Protestants are hypocritical asses. Jesus was a bastard, the Virgin Mary was a whore, and John the Evangelist, Christ's bedfellow.
That was typical Marlowe. Blasphemy, of course, was a crime, but treason was worse. Marlowe was sharing a room with an informer who had much more serious evidence.
Marlowe had been talking about going over to the Catholic side, and even worse, counterfeiting English money before joining the enemy.
Marlowe was sent back to England. From that moment, he was on borrowed time. Meanwhile, in London, Shakespeare's history plays were the must-see of the year.
Look, York, I stained this napkin with the blood that valiant Clifford, with his rapier's point, made issue from the bosom of thy boy.
The three plays spanned 2 blood-soaked centuries of English history.
York cannot speak unless he wear a crown. A crown for York and lords. Bow low to him. Hold his hands whilst I do set it on. Aye, marry, sir. Now looks he like a king. Off with the crown, and with the crown, his head.
She-wolf of France! Oh, tiger's heart, wrapped in a woman's hide. How couldst thou drain the lifeblood of the child, to bid the father wipe his eyes withal, and yet be seen to bear...
Back in Dulwich College, we can see the moment when Shakespeare hit #1 in the box office.
March the 3rd, 1592. Harry VI, takings for Henslowe, £3, 16 shillings and 8p. It was probably the first part of Henry VI, which actually was a prequel in Hollywood terms, rather like they did with Star Wars. The parts 2 and 3 had been so successful they had to do a part 1. And let's just work out these takings now. £3, that's 720p. 16 shillings, that's 292 and 8. 920p. And that's half of the gallery taking, so that's 920 audience in the galleries alone. Add as many as 1,000 in the pit, the groundlings, and you're talking about an audience of nearly 2,000 people. Shakespeare's outstripping all of the people around him. And the total takings, it did 14 more shows in that spring, and took 16,344 pennies just for Henslowe. Thousands and thousands of audience. He's a bigger hit than Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta or Thomas Kyd's Spanish Tragedy. He's made it.
And now the grammar school boy was savaged by the jealous metropolitan critics. The printer, Henry Chettle, published a diatribe against him by an old Queensmen's writer, Robert Greene. Furious that a mere actor thought he could write plays as well as university wits. Greene threw Will's own words back at him.
There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he's as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, a Mr. Do-it-all, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country.
But in early 1593, there were worse things than a bad review. 2 printers were executed for publishing seditious books. The playwright Thomas Kyd was put to the rack. And at the end of May, Marlowe's luck finally ran out.
In 1593, when the boatmen took you down river from the city to Deptford, you arrived here at the Watergate. There was a row of houses with gardens going down to the river. And this was where Christopher Marlowe had made his rendezvous.
The Elizabethan Watergate where Marlowe came that day is still here. Tucked in by the wall of Elizabeth's naval dockyard. Legend has it that Marlowe's last hours were spent in a tavern, but it was a government-safe house run by Mrs. Eleanor Bull, a relative of the spy master Walsingham. And one of the row of houses still survives.
All 3 men that Marlowe had arranged to meet here were on the seamy side of Elizabeth's body politic. And all 3 of them, like Marlowe, had connections with her spy master, Francis Walsingham. First, Ingram Frizzer, speculator, dealer, fixer, a modern man. Second, Nicholas Skeers, con man, racketeer, blackmailer, but a government employee. He'd been the government's plant in the Babington plot which had brought down Mary Queen of Scots. And then there was the 3rd man, Robin Pooley.
The evil genius of the Elizabethan underworld, Pooley was not a man to be trapped with in a little room in Deptford. What was the meeting for? We don't know. But in the eyes of authoritarian states, writers are always dangerous, especially when their words can reach the masses. Marlowe's latest play, Edward II, had been a scathing attack on a corrupt ruler and a fawning court.
About 6 o'clock in the evening, the 4 men came back into the room. Christopher Marlowe, at this point, was lying on a bed. And we know about the bed because of the coroner's inquisition. And according to the inquest, the other 3 were still sitting at table, and Marlowe and Frizzer were exchanging malicious words with each other. And Frizzer was sitting with his back to Marlowe, like this. Marlowe got up off the bed, came behind Frizzer, took his dagger out and pummeled him on the head, wounding him. And at this point, said the witnesses, and of course, we've only got their version of the story. The said Frizzer then struggled with the said Christopher Marlowe to get back from him his dagger aforesaid. And in that affray, the said Frizzer, in defence of his life, with the dagger aforesaid, to the value of 12 pence, gave the said Christopher there and then a mortal wound over the right eye to the depth of 2 inches, of which the said Christopher Marlowe there and then instantly died.
The killers agreed on their story. It was just a fight over the bill, the reckoning. Shakespeare, though, thought otherwise. Not to understand a man's verses, he later wrote, can kill a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room. "1593 was the tale of two young men for whom the sky was the limit. Marlowe, brilliant, devil-may-care, who chose as his motto, 'What feeds me will destroy me.'" And gentle Shakespeare, "How careful I was," he wrote later, "when I took my way, each trifle under truest bars to thrust." So there's the tale of Shakespeare's rise from country boy to the star of the London stage. He'd learned his craft as a poet, but more than that, he'd observed the ways of the world in a time when the state demanded the loyalty of your secret soul.
Now maybe that gives us a clue towards one of the most characteristic qualities in Shakespeare's mind in his later career as a writer. And that's his ability to see things from both sides. He had a fabulous, almost chameleon-like ability to empathize with the other, good or bad. It's not just Juliet or Othello that he's good at. It's evil people like Iago and Macbeth. That's a talent. And it's a talent, I would guess, that he learned early on.
By the time of Marlowe's death, Shakespeare had crowned his English trilogy with a fourth play about the workings of history and the cruelty of power.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this sun of yore. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. But I that am deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me. Since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days.
In the next stage of our search for Shakespeare, we'll see him find fame and fortune only to lose the dearest thing he had. We'll meet the unlikely rivals for his crown. And we'll see how out of the trials of life and love, he created a legacy not of an age, but for all time.